You're listening to Autumn on the Air, the weekly podcast that brings you conversations about the impact of research commercialization and the people who make it happen. Join us for interviews with patent and licensing professionals, innovators, entrepreneurs, and tech transfer leaders on the issues and trends that matter most. Keep listening for an inside track on the people, IP policies, and politics changing our world.
Welcome to Autumn on the Air. Today we're talking about the future of technology transfer, and we have an incredible guest to help us navigate it. If you've ever wondered how tech transfer offices can adapt to this era of rapid and chaotic innovation, this discussion is for you. Our guest today is Nick Webb, bestselling author, futurist, and innovation expert. Nick has worked with some of the biggest brands in the world, holds over 40 patents, and has written books like The Innovation Mandate and What Customers Crave. He's here to share his insights on where technology transfer is headed, how universities can optimize commercialization, and what it takes to build future-ready organizations. Welcome to the podcast, Nick. Really excited to have you on the show today.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
So I thought I'd kick the podcast off by asking you, innovation is evolving rapidly from incremental improvements to disruptive breakthrough. And now what you call chaotic innovation, which you also wrote a really great book about. Can you break that down for us? And how does this shift impact the way universities commercialize technology?
Sure. Well, I think, and there's, I guess, a lot of ways to categorize this, but when I wrote Chaotic Change, I really wanted to look back at my 44 years in the innovation space. And when I started, things were very slow and things were very small. And it was honestly pretty easy to be good as an innovator when things are slow and small. And then when the internet came out, we call that the connection shift. All of a sudden, everything was hyper-connected. Everything was digitized and everything was fast and big. And we started to leave that marketscape of incrementalism to what I refer to as disruptive innovation. And that's where all of us that manage innovation centers and TTOs need to really, develop a range of best practices and technologies to be able to handle the velocity and volume of a marketscape that has become uber complicated. So we transitioned through that. Every year it got faster and bigger and faster and bigger. And then all of a sudden, about 4 or 5 years ago, we had the AI shift. And the AI shift is where things were fast, they were big, but they were also hyper-connected and hyper-digitized while also now being connected to the thinking and learning machine. And then as we transition into this next wave of chaos, we're going to see rapid adoption of new best practices, new technologies, new systems, because at the end of the day, technology transfer really does need to increase the velocity of their pipeline. They need to increase the volume within their pipeline so that we can balance commercial technologies with those social and philanthropic technologies as well.
Now, speaking of velocity, I wanted to ask you, what do you think are some of the biggest inefficiencies you see in traditional tech transfer? And how do you think TTOs can help streamline their processes?
I think that one of the problems is bureaucracy, right? And I think most TTO executives would say, we have to deal with a cultural antibody of bureaucracy. I think the good news is that there's two things that we can do to address that. One is I find that a lot of innovation centers and TTO offices don't do quite a good job of really communicating to leadership about the impact that they're having on the university brand, revenue, and ultimately social impact. So I think if we want to be free to move and to maybe accelerate ourselves, we have to do a better job of selling our value. I think the second thing is now, of course, is the adoption of robotic process automation, all process in terms of IP automation. So I think it's a combination of really making sure everybody knows what your value is so that you have freedom to move, and then you have the technology to accelerate.
Nick, as you know, many TTOs struggle with balancing revenue generation with broader societal impact. From your experience working with Fortune 500 companies and startups, what strategies can help TTOs ensure both financial sustainability and meaningful innovation?
Yeah, I think one thing to keep in mind is that the ultimate locomotive force of social impact is commercialization, right? So they can both live in the same innovation. We can have major social impact while at the same time having a economic dynamic with it, right? So, because really and truly, that's the best way to get impact. I think that ultimately the best organizations also realize that in order to be able to have the bandwidth and the opportunity to do things that are purely philanthropy and socially driven, is that they also have to have enough success to be able to fund it. And that comes from running better pipelines.
Now, you mentioned AI, and I want to go back to that for a second because you operate an AI lab. And I'm curious, how do you see AI reshaping tech transfer, particularly in areas like IP evaluation, licensing, and deal making?
I think this is a really important thing to think about. I just went down to the exhibit hall and some amazing vendors down there with some great technologies. But I hereby proclaim that we are in kinder automation right now. And so if you're looking at this, at automating everything from IP to your pre-funnel scraping to your FFE activities, your staged analysis, and all these kinds of things, just realize that what you see today is going to be far more sophisticated in just 12 months. So I really believe that there are some of these technologies that are essentially designed to be integrated technologies to do IP, to do research, to do commercialization. The other word of warning that I would give, in addition to the fact that we have to recognize that we're in a kinder stage of technological development, is being really careful about over-reliance on the technology. Because, a good executive and leader in technology transfer is never going to be replaced by the robot. So we have to remember we need to keep our human intelligence, our real intelligence in this process.
Yeah, and I think that's really true because I've started integrating AI into my practice, which is IP. And there are certain things it's great for, helps improve efficiencies, but like you said, it can't do everything. So I think it's finding where it's most efficient and also where it works the best, right? Because I've tried AI tools for like claim drafting and other things, and it doesn't really work so well. But other things that I do, the AI works really well. And I think that's a similar type of approach that TTOs can take as well.
I think that's right. And I think there will be a time where, we actually are seeing a really comprehensive output from AI in terms of patent development and drafting, but it can never be without the supervision of
Absolutely.
the IP count. Look at MRIs. MRIs, take radiological data and determines all kinds of stuff, but you would never want the MRI to diagnose your, cancer, right? And so that's the one thing we have to realize. Great tool, super powerful, but it's not going to replace IP lawyers or technology executives.
Yeah, and you have to be careful with it. It hallucinates. Even with the best prompts, it will still hallucinate on you. So you have to be very, very careful. Yeah, it is pretty funny. Speaking of IP, you are an inventor on 40 patents. And based on your experience, what do you think university innovators and tech transfer professionals should be thinking about when it comes to protecting and positioning their IP for commercial success?
Well, obviously, the key to success of a good TTO office, from my observations and research, is having great strategic partners with IP counsel, right? And they will help resolve a lot of potential problems. The other thing that's interesting that I've discovered recently, very recently, is that unfortunately, a lot of technology transfer offices have very bureaucratic IP policies. And 99% was about keeping faculty happy, I feel like.
Yes,
right?
That's been my experience as well.
Yeah. So, but that guidance document really needs to not just be, having fair and thoughtful partnerships with faculty and research and vendors. It also has to be a document that determines IP and innovation throughput. And so, what's the HXI aspect of that strategy? What are we doing to get more commercial interest? How are we broadening our commercial partnerships? How are we, and the list goes on and on. So I think that we really need to I think right now would be a great time for most people to reevaluate their policies, their IP policies, and ask themselves, is it completely and totally around faculty satisfaction, or is it a document that will actually increase technology licensing?
One thing I've seen that I'd be curious to get your opinion on is I've seen some tech transfer offices, you have a well-known PI, he comes in and it's easier not to say no,
Right.
then, just file the patent application, even if they don't believe it's patentable. And I think then I've seen tech transfer offices get into this rut, but then they're filing on everything that comes from that PI just because it's a little bit easier and there's less politics involved.
Yeah, that is a really big issue. And all that's doing is kicking the can down the road, because sooner or later, just like I mentioned during my presentation today, is that telling an inventor that technology is not currently commercially viable is like telling them their baby's ugly.
Exactly.
Right? And so you can tell them now or you can tell them later. But that's why I like having internal podcasts. I like having internal communication strategies for TTO offices where they are very, very judicious and thoughtful about the way in which they communicate their value. But the other thing is training. We do a thing called the Innovation Superstar Bootcamp, and that bootcamp really gets them vested into understanding what the process really looks like. And, most faculty and researchers are really smart, good people. And once they understand the science that we all use every day in the commercialization of technology, I find that they respect that and want to be an active participant. I've also found that doing those kinds of programs can help create additive ideation to where they go, well, now that I know that, what can we do to improve the layer, making that more of a layered and dynamic innovation that has more commercial value?
Tell us a little bit more about that boot camp in case some of our listeners are interested.
So we do a thing called the Innovation Superstar Bootcamp. We have a master's program, what we call the Innovation Superstar Master, and then we have another program that's called the Innovation Superstar Startup. And they're both really about how do you take a product, taking the complexity of innovation management and making it understandable and approachable to smart people that don't have our vernacular and our understanding of the mechanics of an innovation pipeline. And you make it fun. We have we come in and do this for them, and then eventually they do it themselves every year. And they don't need to follow our curriculum, but rather they do it themselves or do what we do. The two big ones are the ability to create one around helping inventors understanding the process. And I'll tell you, that saves so much pain. What I have seen that's really sad is I've seen so many times where technology transfer offices, and I'm be interested to see what that number is. I don't know if we could ever get to that, but where faculty and researchers believe it's where innovations go to die. And it's unfortunate because one prominent, important investigator said that they rejected as innovation, and now the rule of the land is they're horrible. That's all fixable. It's fixable through internal brand building. It's fixable by doing a lot of things. We like using submission toggles and innovation submission processes that sort of dehumanizes so that, hey man, it's not me, it's the machine. Right.
That's great, though. Yeah, it takes the people factor out of it.
It does, and then again, doing internal communication strategies. I like internal podcast where you have your chief innovation officer or your technology transfer executive involved in saying, hey, here's what we do. And hey, what do you do when you think you've got a great idea and the center tells you it's a joke? And you have somebody who's had that happen. They talk, hey, look, I was really sad about it, but once I understood the process, I was able to submit another idea that did have commercial, and we had a happy ending. So I think that's where we can address that issue. Unfortunately, a lot of people are incidental about this.
That's been my experience. I want to turn to another criticism sometimes to tech transfer offices and universities, and that relates to licensing revenue and not enough startup creation or partnerships. How do you think TTOs can strike the right balance between licensing, startups, and open innovation models?
I think that a lot of that has to do with the size of the shop, right? If you're a major branded university and you've got 600 people in your technology transfer and innovation center, then it's one thing. And if you have a small shop that's 1 to 3 people, it's something else. I do feel that the challenges that we are going to see that are going to be really profound in terms of potential loss of federal grant money.
Yeah, grant money.
In combination with some other revenue, and I won't get into the politics of this, but some of the other revenue streams that go into universities, there are a few of them that are at risk, right? So I personally believe that we are going to see a transmutation in university research to where we're building really, really robust partnerships with industry. So we're basically the innovation arm of these strategic partners in combination with really being in the startup business, because that's a great way to monetize. It is really where we're going to see more of that than the old kind of something comes in and we figure out what to do with it model. I think that's got to be the case.
Yeah. I spoke with Holden Thorpe, who's the editor-in-chief of the Science series of journals, and he said something similar about the need for university industry partnerships. Given that is likely to be the case, and I do agree with you, what makes the best partnerships work, and where do you see these collaborations having some potential to break down?
So, what I always recommend to people, I wrote 2 best-selling books on customer experience, what customers crave and what customers hate. And I spent a lot of time, because really human experience is just another innovation medium. And what we find is on our commercial centers for innovations and our health and hospital centers, we do a lot of work in the area of people will parachute us in and we serve as their fractional chief innovation officer. And then we actually build out their center. And then eventually we turn the keys over to an employee. And what I find is that in order to really develop great partnerships, you have to have a formal CX, what we call a CX strategy. And I think there are 2 things you have to look at. What are we good at? What do we have true differentiated value within our research or within our university? And then who are the partners that are potentially the beneficiaries of that expertise? Some universities are really good at life science. Some have no life science whatsoever. So I think we have to begin with what is our core efficacy? What is our core capability? Where can we deliver unique thought value? And then from there, how do we create the fibers of connectivity to the industrial arms? And also, I think those need to be much broader. There's a country song called "I Got a Guy." Like, you call your friend and you say, "Hey, I need somebody to help my roof. He goes, "Oh, I got a guy for that. I got a guy." Right. And this is not a guy thing necessarily. The point is that we have experts that we refer all the time. 80% of revenue comes from referrals. And that's why there are 4 different quadrants of revenue. If we look at those 4 quadrants of revenue, having a reputation with great industry partners is the best way for a technology transfer office to drive growth.
Yeah, and along those same lines, you talked about it this morning. These are challenging and chaotic times, and there's a lot of uncertainty, and TTOs are certainly being forced to do more with less, cutting costs while increasing their commercialization success. Do you have some practical steps that TTOs can take to optimize operations without sacrificing impact?
Yeah, it's interesting. And again, I don't have any data in front of me, but I wouldn't be surprised to find out that, oftentimes any of us have a contemporaneous strategic plan, right? And if we don't have a strategic plan, then we don't have enabling technologies and all the things to get from here to there. So I think what we like is what we call an innovation maturity assessment. What is your maturity in terms of efficiencies? What is your maturity models around the experiences that you deliver to inventors and to the commercial partners? What is your current level of maturity in technology adoption and so on? So really looking at the various aspects that make up our department, or our shop, as some of them call them, and find out what we can do to improve those. Now, robotic process automation I mentioned today, 30%, 40% reductions. We just did a project for a client in LA where they got a $10.7 million return on their investment with us just by finding broken things. And it's not that we're better, it's just our perch is different, right? We're from the outside, that we're not tainted by the political ether. And so we can come in and say, look, from a practical perspective, your survival requires that you fix these 9 things. So sometimes it's better to get somebody from the outside to take a look at that.
Yeah, for a variety of reasons. I can see where that was definitely very beneficial. We've touched on this a little bit about researchers. Another challenge TTOs face is getting researchers engaged in the commercialization process. Some of them just want to do research, as you well know. What have you seen work well in terms of incentivizing faculty and researchers to think beyond their labs and more towards market applications?
Well, as I mentioned today in my keynote, there's a very, very prolific trend called search stacking, right? And people are looking at micro learning, or what some refer to as nano learning. these are smart people that are good learners, and they are interested. And sometimes I don't know if they're completely respected in terms of, hey, you're really, really bright. You may be a chemist, or you may be a whatever, but we would like to show you our science and get you involved in understanding, and maybe have them involved in some activities within there. We used to do with one of our companies, we used to create innovation champions, and in almost every area, those champions would sort of be our eyes and ears within a department or within a lab to be able to help them understand the commercial thing. It was a peer. We would train other researchers or faculty to be a certified champion. And it really was a beautiful way to create a bridge between the researcher faculty member and the Center for Innovation.
That's a really great idea, champions. That I've seen that work in law firms as well. I think that's a really great idea to get more researchers involved. You've written several books. I've read Chaotic Change, which I thought was great, but I want to talk about Innovation Mandate, which talks about how organizations can build a structured approach to innovation. What lessons from that book do you think can be applied to TTOs that are looking to modernize their operations?
I really feel with the environmental changes that will be impacting universities and technology transfer offices, I think this is a time, and I mentioned this during my talk today, I started my talk out by saying that innovation has just been reinvented. It's been said before, but this time we for realsies mean it. It actually has been reinvented. So if I were in their shoes, we talk about technology triage all the time. And the idea of triage is going in there and finding out, what technologies within a bucket are viable and which ones aren't. I think we need to take a triage approach towards the systems, the tools, the processes, the methodologies, and the technology stacks. Those should all be up for a housekeeping and analysis today so they can be optimized. There's just too many things that's changed. I think about books that I wrote 8 years ago, and honestly, they were completely linear ideas that were, cutting edge at the time, and now they're just outdated. And you really have to be open to the newness of these great new practices.
Now, we talked about industry partnerships before, and we all know that some of the frustrations expressed about dealing with university technologies is the pace of the commercialization, because it can be slow, particularly compared to industry. What do you think some specific industry best practices are that TTOs can adopt to help speed up, whether it's negotiations, licensing, or maybe even startup launches?
So I think there's three things. One is they really need to do a better job on the front end of not wasting time on technologies that don't have a prayer. And there's so many ways we can automate that and make it less painful. The second thing is, it's surprising how few people are doing this, but the ones that are doing it in a very big way, and that's fast track methodologies. And if you take a look at fast track methodologies, what it basically says is that quality and innovation are not impacted at all. We're just putting speed at the top of the pyramid. And it's easy to assume that it's flippant, that it's reckless. But the truth of the matter is, when you look at the science of fast track methods, and we've been using them for years, all they do is speed things up. There is no In fact, what we find is there's higher degrees of iterative ideation that happens as a result of the way in which it's structured properly. So the first thing is that what are you doing with the intention of making speed a priority? That's probably the best thing. And then lastly, one of the best ways to make that happen better is, as I mentioned earlier on, you got to get permission to move. And that means you have to sell your value proposition to the chieftains.
Absolutely. We talked about you being an inventor on patents before, but universities are now starting to look at other ways to monetize some of their assets, things like know-how, data, and software. How do you think universities should be thinking about monetizing these kind of non-traditional IP assets?
Well, there's so many smart people in this space. For an example, training programs, certification training programs. That one thing that works really, really well, and we own a company called LearnLogic, where we do certification training. One of the things that works really well is the particularized training, right? Really, really specific training. Like, how do you triage a technology, like a whole certification program just on technology triage. So if you look at it, there's about 16 different slivers that you can make across the innovation pipeline. And you just do a cert train for each one of those 16.
That's amazing.
Yeah, and that is a great way to do it. I think the other thing is that, as I mentioned in my talk today, I like mechanical designs. That's my thing. I like the physicality and the tactile nature of mechanical things. And I also like molecular things, although I'm not a chemist, they interest me. We're now going beyond the bright, shiny object. And that means we're inventing connection architecture, digital things, and we're inventing human experiences and new business model concepts. And many of these are, as you know, patentable, and they're differentiated. What I see right now, the startups that are doing the best, their innovation is the business model, has nothing to do with the subject technology or any other value proposition. So I think there's some learnings there, what's happening in the commercial world.
So, Nick, looking ahead, what emerging trends in technology or business models do you think tech transfer professionals should be paying attention to try and future-proof their work?
I think that, first and foremost, as I know I sound like a broken record here, but I believe the human experience, in fact, I have a book coming out this fall called Human Experience Innovation, and it's based on what I'm seeing bubbling up everywhere, that it turns out that the overwhelming majority of revenue and profitability and even innovation is driven by the best experiences. But the experience lives across the entire experiential ecosystem. We do a lot of launch planning for companies, and we'll look at who's the buyer. For an example, with a drug, what is their benefits people think about it? What does the ambulatory surgery center that implants this device think about it? What does third-party providers think about it? What is the patient's partner think about it? What? And you begin to realize there's 60, 70 different things that live within this experiential ecosystem. I think they're going to see that as a big trend. I think we're going to see the creation of the AI artifacts as being a huge opportunity. We just prepared 3 cases just before I left. I haven't reviewed them yet around optimizing the way in which we get insights about what customers think about an experience or what a patient thinks about an experience. And then, lastly, of course, I think we're going to see a rapid growth in business model innovations. Because, take a look at PillPack that was purchased for, I think, $90 million. It's an envelope. It's just an envelope, right? And they sold for like $90 million. I think that is really exciting to see these new business models of having tremendous intellectual property value.
Now, for TTOs that want to improve their commercialization impact, but are feeling constrained by bureaucracy and or limited resources, Nick, what's one high impact action you think they could take right now?
I cover this a few times. It just seems to me to make the most sense is that they have to be able to sell their value. I think so many of them, the bureaucracy exists. There is easily and I see this in my consulting practice all the time. We could easily clear the runway, right? It's easy, but they don't think it's worth it because they don't see the enterprise, the university or research value up to some, and to a certain extent, it's because of some of the sluggishness in a culture too. So one of the things that we do is what's called enterprise innovation, is develop a challenge within your TTO, and it's the optimization challenge, and ask 3 questions. How can we generate more revenue? How can we improve the experience for our inventors and our commercial partners? And how can we deliver additional social and societal impact? You'll be amazed how those things work. We did a project for an organization that had to save about $80 million quick. So they brought in forensic accountants, and they spent $7 million with forensic accountants trying to figure out where the waste was. And then they wound up saving $400,000. And then they brought in the Kung Fu, Six Sigma, lean people, right?
Yeah.
Right. That didn't get them anywhere. And so we came in and we said, let's create the biggest loser challenge. We had to get approval through internal branding and through their legal department to use the word loser because it seemed too flippant, right? So we created this challenge and we said, dear 3,800 employees, tell us join this contest and win by telling us where the biggest wastes are. The first thing that came in was $1 million where they were spending money watering plants in clinical areas where plants weren't even supposed to be.
Oh my gosh.
The
really?
next one, which I never realized, this is the big health system, that they were spending $3,800 a day on fax paper. I'm like, how is that possible?
Nobody faxes really anymore.
In healthcare, it's ubiquitous still, right? So what was happening is they were getting junk faxes, which I never even knew existed. Now, this was a few years ago, and so nobody even said that. But anyway, a little here, a little there. Pretty soon,
added up.
We were at something like 67, I think, when we exited that project, and now it's an ongoing project. You can do that with how do we improve relationships with, and you use a thing called an ESN, an enterprise social network, which that already has the gamification and social engagement pieces in. It's amazing. I encourage anybody in this space to research enterprise innovation. It's a beautiful thing.
So, Nick, if you and I were to have this conversation again in 10 years, and hopefully we'll talk sooner than 10 years, what do you think will have changed the most in the world of technology transfer and innovation?
I think the two things. One is unbelievable, hard to even imagine levels of automation. I mentioned in my keynote presentation, we hired 5 or 6 employees. I think 2 of them were humans. AI agents are running our entire lead pipeline. So I think that automation is going to go to a level in this space that's really hard to even imagine. I think the second thing is despite the fact that we're going hyper technical, we're also at the same time going to go hyper human. And that means we're going to build better, real human experiences and relationships with commercial partners and with our innovators and researchers.
Well, Nick, this has been an incredible conversation. Your perspective on innovation and tech transfer has been incredibly valuable. Thank you for your keynote as well this morning. Before we wrap up, where can our listeners connect with you to learn more about your work?
Yeah, sure. So in our consulting business, it's really simple. It's www.goleaderlogic.com. And again, we do innovation management. We do fractional CEO services. For those of you in the device space, we do a lot of work in the medical device space. We have a website called WebLogic, just my last name, logic.com. And then, of course, speaking is just simply nickwebb.com.
Well, thanks so much again, Nick. It's been great having you on the podcast.
My pleasure. Thanks so much.
Thanks for listening to Autumn on the Air with Lisa Mueller. Get social with us and share your thoughts. You can tweet us at AUTM or visit us online at AUTM.net. We'll be back next week on the air. Be sure to join us.